in it. Nobody would be allowed to do it. Now we have a situation more and more, of course, where the ocean the reason why the freedom of seas came in is because in the 18th century, the 17th century, and the freedom of seas doctrine comes in, the ocean was superabundant. With so many fish, nobody even thought in terms of property resource in them. However, we're getting to the point, obviously, more and more, where the fish are getting scarcer and scarcer. The government tries to meet this by having all sorts of crazy regulations, like limiting the number of months you can catch the fish, or limiting the size, and having anti-technological regulation. You can't use super nets. You can only use small hand nets. You can cut down the size of the catch. Or having seasons. Well, any way you do this, first of all, this doesn't help. It's like rationing. It doesn't help increase the resource as aquaculture would in private property. And second of all, it messes things up. It distorts things. For example, if you say you can only fish starting on March the 1st, and then you have a certain limit, say, on the catch, and what happens is, this is what happens with salmon in the Northwest, everybody comes in with huge boats and they fish like mad to try to beat out the other guy until the total number of salmon reaches its maximum limit. As a result, the amount of salmon gets cut in the season for catching salmon gets compressed from 6 months to 3 weeks or 6 weeks, whatever it is. And this distorts everything. It distorts the technology. The salmon aren't as tasty. Too many big boats get built. There's an overinvestment in huge boats. And all the rest of it. There's a complete distortion of the salmon market as a result of these regulations. Aside from the craziness of not allowing super nets or whatever other super technology to increase fish productivity. Now, if private property were allowed in parts of the ocean, you have things like this. You'd fencing off of parts of the ocean. It could have been done even before the electronic period. You could have anchors in the ocean. But now with electronics, it's duck soup. You can easily have electronic fencing. There's no problem with that. If they allow you to do it, in other words, if you're assured of the fact that some other fisherman is not going to come along and grab all your fish inside the fence. Okay, if you have private property rights then in parts of the ocean, you have this sort of electronic fencing. You can use the equivalent of fertilizer. The first thing you can do right now, even before any improvement in fish technology, is you can segregate the big fish from the little fish, segregate by size. Unfortunately, fish have not found out about natural rights and the non-aggression axiom. And so the big fish have to eat little fish, even incestuously. If you separate the little fish from the big fish, you'll enormously increase fish production just right there. You give them something else to eat, give them plankton or whatever. Just that, doing nothing else but electronic fencing and segregating fish by size will enormously increase fish productivity. And there's lots of other things, obviously, that could be done if aquaculture were allowed, if private property in parts of the ocean were allowed. Now, this is getting to be a very dicey question because we're getting now to, not all the ocean, by the way, is really important in this connection. We're really talking about the continental shelves and the North Atlantic and parts of the North Pacific. And we have a situation with the ocean in these areas getting very scarce. They're getting to a point, we have many areas where, say, Russian trawlers are trying to fish, fishermen are trying to fish from their boats, nets are coming out in some other way from land-based, somebody's trying to drill for offshore oil, and something else is happening. 5 or 6 people competing for one lousy piece of ocean. They cannot resolve that unless private property rights are allowed in parts of the ocean. I think that probably something like this will happen. If it won't be private property, at least it will be national property. At least in some way they'll be able to keep out, to allocate. Well, obviously private property is the only correct solution here. But at least there must be some way of ending ocean communism, because otherwise there'll be no way of exploiting these resources at all. Of course, there's some offshore drilling. The Japanese have beds which are underneath the water, where they have private property. That's not really separate from the land. It's really just out from the coast. So there's been a little bit of that, but obviously this is the next great frontier for production, and it can only be used if we allow private property in it. So that's the fish caper. Incidentally, I recommend here a very good book by Christie and Scott called The Commonwealth and Ocean Fisheries, which deals with legal, economic, political, and all the problems connected with international fish, the whole ocean question. Another area which partakes of both water and land is oil pools, petroleum. One of the problems with petroleum, which led to original over-drilling, ravaging of our petroleum crude oil resources, which then led to a monstrous cartelization by the government, was that because of the way the law of capture worked with oil. Well, the way the common law was applied when oil was first discovered, you dig a drill down to the part of the pool, you find this pool, and then you can use as much as you want of that oil. You can drill as much as you want of it. Nobody owns the pool itself. Now, obviously, the oil pool is a technological unit. And yet, since no private property was allowed in the oil pool, but only in the use of the oil, we have the same situation developed as in the case of the fisheries. Every man and his brother rushes in to take advantage of this and put a drill down there. And you have hundreds of drills going now. First of all, you have over-drilling, a lot of investment in drilling, etc. If I don't drill oil as fast as possible, the other guys will pump it up, and pretty soon it'll be in a whirlpool. The way to solve this is to allow private property in the resource itself and not just in the annual use of it. 20 guys now drilling in the same oil pool, they should be allowed to unitize, to merge in one corporation or company, which would then own the whole oil pool. It's now, I believe, illegal to do that, some sort of antitrust violation or something, to unitize your oil holdings that you can then, one corporation, one firm, and own the whole pool. But until we do that, there'll be then a tendency toward overuse and over-depletion of this oil pool. And then, of course, the government comes in and has its proration plan, paralyzes and restricts production on top of all this. Not, of course, solving this problem, just adding another one on top of it. But again, you have the same problem, not allowing, because of the legal structure, the government's legal structure, not allowing private property in the technological unit. Then we have the oil pool. Now we have another area where the government doesn't allow private property ownership, in a sense overuse, I guess. Well, here the problem is a little bit different. But again, you have an area where the government does not allow allows the use of something, but doesn't allow property in the resource itself. And these are radio and TV channels. Again, you have a situation where radio was first invented. The question is, how do the courts deal with this whole question? Who owns what? And during the early 20s, when radio was first coming in, people are operating radio stations in Detroit at certain kilocycles, and et cetera, et cetera. And somebody else would then beam something in the same kilocycle nearby. There'd be interference, and they went to the courts. And the courts would then could only decide on the basis of common law, which is basically libertarian. And they began to make decisions. The Illinois courts, for example, made decisions. Okay, here's what you do. The guy who homesteads, in a sense, in other words, the guy who first sets up his channel at 1,600 kilocycles, or blah, 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 owns that kilocycle, or owns the right to beam out on that frequency. Then you have to find a technological unit. This is, you find it for 160 acres of wetland or for this oil pool. The technological unit is fairly easy to find out. It's a certain width, whatever the width of the band is, so you don't have interference, and the radius of the frequency beam is sent out. So you decide, okay, you have a 200-mile radius, let's say, and you own the 1,600 kilocycles within a band of plus or minus a certain number of kilocycles for this 200-mile period. And anybody who interferes with this is a transgressor and is aggressing against your property. You can take an injunction and smash them. Now this is beginning to be developed in the early 20s. Now what happens is that Herbert Hoover, now why he did this I don't really know. Nobody, as far as I know, has investigated the infamous Radio Act in 1926, I think it was. Hoover decided there's a terrible things going on. People interfering in each other's radio channels. We can't allow this, and private enterprise hasn't worked in this area, and private property. Therefore, we have to nationalize the radio frequencies. He did, because he did not tell the rest of the country about the court decisions, which were quietly going on at the same time. So Hoover, who was the Secretary of Commerce at the time, pushes through the Radio Act, which nationalized radio channels, and later on, of course, TV channels. This means the channels all are owned by the government, not by private people. In order to be allowed graciously to use channel 1,600 kilocycles, you have to get a license from the Federal Communications Commission. And this means, of course, total totalitarian control over the media, radio and TV media. And it's a total suppression of free speech, free press, and I don't know why nobody seems to realize this, because, for example, the FCC requires so-called balanced news. For a long time, they didn't allow any editorials, because an editorial means somehow you're loading the dice. They demand equal time by every cluck who comes on with a certain point of view. So it's got to be balanced. It can't be this, can't be that, which really means if you take any kind of position at all, which is certainly any position which differs from the majority, you get clobbered by the FCC. The FCC doesn't renew your license. And this is complete totalitarianism. Supposing, for example, it's applied to the press and magazines and books and newspapers. Supposing the government said, okay, from now on there's blah, 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 we have interference, there's scarcity of newsprint. That's another argument for nationalization, the fact that the radio and TV channels are scarce. Of course, everything's scarce, as we should know by this time. Every darn thing that's not free is scarce. So, newsprint is scarce, we nationalize everything. The government then nationalizes everything and then licenses people to be allowed to print stuff. Well, in that case, we would have a similar situation. Any newspaper steps out of line a little bit, a little too radical, a little too rambunctious. Your license is not going to be a renewed buster. Of course, you have complete freedom of speech, but you can't operate without a license. You can't produce anything, you can't sell anything without a license. Now, this would be considered total totalitarianism, fascism of the worst sort. And yet, we allow the same thing to happen in radio and TV, and nobody protests about it. This is the exact same situation. There was, for example, a heroic libertarian radio station in Hawaii not too long ago, an FM station, I think, which is quite popular, which was beaming libertarian broadcasts several hours a night, which then got clobbered by the FCC because of unbalanced reporting or whatever, and they threatened to take their license away, and they didn't have the money even to fight the legal fee to fight the license, so they just folded up. So this is just a small indication, but the thing is obviously it permeates. It has what the courts call a chilling effect on any kind of real freedom of speech in the media. And this is a direct result of nationalization. What happens is that the networks, for example, have this big bonus in the fact that they're allowed to use these channels for nothing. They don't have to pay any money for it, either to anybody else or the government or whatever. So you have this peculiar situation where the networks are locked into a subsidy because they're getting the use of the channel free, and yet they have no real power over it. They have no power over what they say, etc. Of course, one argument technologically is that now with UHF and with FM, etc., and cable, there are a lot more channels. I mean, the range of channels has increased. But the principle is still there, the idea that you should nationalize something because it's scarce, completely justify any kind of collectivism, except the air, which also has been collectivized anyway. So the government owns the air. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, I think I've already talked about traffic ingestion as part of the fruits of price control. But here again, we have a situation, looking at it from another angle. The streets and the roads are all owned by the government. There's no private property allowed on the streets, except for a few isolated communities. And again, the government has no incentive for any kind of rational pricing system or any kind of preservation of the resource or whatever. And as a result, you have a situation where the government keeps the price at zero, the price of using the streets. The result, of course, is congestion, shortages. In other words, traffic congestion, especially in downtown areas, especially in rush hours, etc. And the parking pricing is... We've discussed now the various areas of so-called overuse and capitalist depletion. We also have other areas where part of the conservation argument is so-called pollution. Two really very different wings to the conservationist argument. One is the idea of overuse and ravaging of resource and destruction and depletion. The other is the idea of pollution, which is really two different things. However, the problem is still the same. Pollution comes about, or rather, pollution beyond the optimum comes about because the government does not allow private property to function in these areas. Somehow this has not been stressed of the cause of the pollution problem in the media. But this is what it boils down to. Private property has not been either used or been allowed to exert itself to the full. We can't be against all pollution, period. There's obviously a certain optimal degree of pollution. For example, we'll take littering the beach. You have a situation, you have beach communism. In other words, the government owns the beaches, and everybody then, of course, litters the beach. If, on the other hand, you have private ownership of the beaches, then the private owner would have to decide on his own, well, let's see, should I really be a tough Puritan type and insist on total being expelled immediately for any kind of littering, or should I sort of look the other way and allow a little bit of littering? It'll be up to him to decide. In other words, optimal amount of littering. Because littering is not the only value he's got on his mind. He also wants to maximize his revenue, and of course, people on the one hand don't want to go to a dirty beach, on the other hand they want to be oppressed by some guard breathing down their neck all the time as they drop a popsicle wrapper. Now, probably in the free market there would be different degrees of beaches. There'd be really tough beaches where you can't hardly do anything, and other beaches which would be sort of permissive and you can litter around and stuff around, etc. And people will then gravitate to what they're interested in. There'd be different qualities of beach and different prices of beach also. But of course, when the government comes in, you immediately have this uniform sort of thing, and either you have complete littering, or else you have the hot hand of fascism down your neck, arresting you for 6 months or something for litter. Either complete non-use of the resource, or also the meat axe approach, which incidentally, again, going back to the traffic congestion, is typical of a government. They set the price of riding the streets at zero, and then when traffic appears and develops, etc., then they turn for the meat axe as a solution and threaten to prohibit private cars altogether, which is the mayor of New York is always trying to do, is always threatening to prohibit all private cars from entering Manhattan, which of course is typical government solution of a problem which the government itself creates by setting the price at zero, either a zero price or a total outlawry, the only way the government can look at things. Okay, two areas of pollution which are particularly, of course, talked about, and again where the non-use of private property provides us with a key explanation. One is water pollution. Waters are being deadened, the waters are being destroyed, and so forth. Again, of course, in the case of the oceans, we're already seeing the fact nobody can own parts of the ocean, so we dump sewage out into the ocean without any compunction. The oil companies, you will allow oil slicks to develop, etc., because nobody owns it. And second of all, the same way with the rivers. The rivers are non-owned. In other words, they're owned by the government. So you have, in effect, river communism. Nobody really owns the rivers. And so everybody dumps sewage into the rivers, and you have polluted rivers, and et cetera. And incidentally, the